The warnings came in whispers at first. American soldiers will show no mercy to medical staff. They target hospitals deliberately. Nurses especially must be prepared for the worst. These words echoed through the corridors of Japanese field hospitals across the Pacific Islands in 1945. Every nurse heard them. Every nurse believed them. In the medical station on Saipan, 23-year-old nurse Yamada clutched a small glass vial in her pocket. Inside was enough cyanide to end her life quickly. Her supervisor had distributed them 2 weeks earlier when the bombing intensified. Better to die with honor than face what comes after capture. The other nurses nodded solemnly as they tucked away their own vials. The propaganda posters plastered on hospital walls showed grotesque caricatures of American soldiers. Beneath the images were stark warnings about what these barbarians did to women. Radio broadcasts reinforced the message daily. Surrender meant torture. Capture meant violation. Death was the only honorable choice. Nurse Tanaka wrote to her mother in Nagasaki that spring, "If the Americans come, do not expect me home. I have made my peace." Her mother would understand. Every Japanese woman understood. The stories from Nanking were still fresh. What armies did to nurses and civilians was common knowledge. The Americans would surely be worse. The senior medical officer gathered the nursing staff each morning for instructions. He taught them to use scalpels as weapons. He showed them where to cut their own arteries if capture became imminent. Some nurses practiced with red ink on their wrists. They memorized the motion. Quick and deep. No hesitation. At night in their quarters, the nurses spoke in hushed tones about their families. They shared photographs worn soft from handling. They wrote final letters that would never be sent. Some prayed to ancestors for courage. Others simply sat in silence, preparing their minds for what seemed inevitable. The military distributed pamphlets describing American atrocities in the Philippines. Nurses there had suffered terribly before death. The details were graphic, the implications clear. When the enemy came, there would be no mercy for medical staff. The Red Cross on their armbands meant nothing to these foreign devils. Each passing day brought the Americans closer. Each night brought darker dreams. The nurses continued their duties, tending to wounded soldiers. But always that small vial remained close at hand. The hospital compound fell silent on July 9, 1945. No more artillery, no more bomber engines overhead. The sudden quiet felt wrong after weeks of constant bombardment. Nurse Yamada peered through a crack in the wooden wall. American tanks rolled past the destroyed gates. Soldiers followed on foot, rifles ready. The senior medical officer had already fled into the mountains with the able-bodied staff. Only 12 nurses remained with the wounded, who could not be moved. They had volunteered to stay, knowing what it meant. Someone had to tend the dying. Someone had to face whatever came next. The nurses gathered in the supply room as boots thundered outside. Some held hands. Others fingered their hidden vials. Nurse Tanaka whispered a Buddhist prayer. The younger ones wept quietly. They had treated American prisoners before the siege. Those men had died screaming from their wounds. Now the tables would turn. The door burst open. 3 American soldiers entered, weapons drawn. The nurses pressed against the back wall. One soldier shouted something in English. None of them understood. He repeated it louder. A 4th soldier appeared with a Japanese-American interpreter. "You are prisoners of war. Put your hands where we can see them." Step forward slowly. The nurses obeyed, expecting rough hands to grab them immediately. Instead, the soldiers stepped back, maintaining distance. They gestured toward the door with their rifles, but did not touch anyone. The nurses shuffled outside into blinding sunlight. More Americans surrounded the hospital. They wore dirty uniforms and looked exhausted. Some had bandages on their arms and heads. These were not the monsters from the posters. They looked like the wounded soldiers the nurses had been treating for months. Just younger. Just foreign. The interpreter spoke again. "You will continue your medical duties. Our wounded need care too. You will not be harmed if you cooperate." Nurse Yamada could not process the words. "Continue working as nurses?" The Americans herded them to a corner of the courtyard. A soldier brought water in a metal bucket. Another carried a crate of rations. They set both down and withdrew immediately. The nurses stared at the supplies. No one moved to take them. This had to be a trick. The moment they reached for water, something terrible would happen. Minutes passed. The Americans simply watched from a distance, smoking cigarettes, talking among themselves. The American medical officer arrived that afternoon with 2 army nurses. He surveyed the damaged hospital through wire-rimmed glasses. The interpreter translated his words carefully. "You are medical personnel. The Geneva Convention protects you. You will help treat wounded from both sides." Nurse Yamada could not believe what she heard. Geneva Convention? Protection? These concepts seemed impossible. Yet the American nurses approached them without hostility. One offered a box of clean bandages. Another demonstrated how to use the sulfur powder they had brought. The Japanese nurses were assigned separate quarters in the undamaged wing. 12 beds with actual mattresses, clean sheets, a door that locked from the inside. The American officer pointed to the lock specifically. "For your privacy and safety, no one will enter without permission." That first night, none of them slept. They waited for the door to break open, for soldiers to storm in, for the real treatment to begin, but only silence filled the corridors. Occasionally a guard walked past outside. His footsteps faded without stopping. Morning brought more confusion. An American nurse knocked politely before entering. She carried fresh uniforms and soap. Through the interpreter, she explained they would work regular shifts. 8 hours on duty, 16 hours rest. The same schedule as American nurses. In the makeshift operating room, Nurse Tanaka worked beside an American doctor. He treated her as he did his own staff. He asked for instruments by pointing. He nodded when she anticipated his needs. When she suggested a different suture technique through the interpreter, he considered it seriously. The wounded Americans looked at them with curiosity, not hunger. Some even attempted clumsy Japanese phrases. "Thank you. Good morning." One young Marine with a stomach wound held Nurse Yamada's hand as she changed his dressing. His grip was desperate with pain, nothing more. The American nurses shared their meals with them. Coffee that tasted like dirt, crackers that crumbled to dust, canned meat that resembled nothing familiar. But it was food freely given, no price attached. No demands made in return. By the 3rd day, Nurse Yamada realized she had not touched the cyanide vial. It sat forgotten in her pocket. Around her, the other nurses moved through their duties with growing bewilderment. They were treating patients. They were eating regularly. They were sleeping safely behind a door they controlled. Everything they had been told was wrong. The American chaplain visited the hospital every Sunday. He carried a worn Bible and spoke softly to the wounded. Nurse Yamada watched him pray with dying soldiers. He held their hands the same way she did with Japanese patients. Death looked identical on both sides. One morning, the chaplain approached the nurses through the interpreter. He had learned they had not received mail in months. Would they like to write letters home? The Red Cross could deliver them. The nurses exchanged uncertain glances. Letters to Japan? From American captivity. The chaplain produced paper and pencils. No censorship except military information. Write what you wish. Tell your families you are safe. He left the supplies and walked away. No supervision. No threats about what to write. Nurse Tanaka stared at the blank page for hours. How could she explain? "Mother, I am alive. The Americans feed us. They do not touch us. We work as nurses still." The words seemed like lies even as she wrote them. Her mother would think she had been forced to write propaganda. The American nurses puzzled them most. These women worked freely alongside men. They gave orders to orderlies. They walked alone at night between wards. No one bothered them. They treated the Japanese nurses as colleagues, not enemies. One American nurse named Betty shared her chocolate ration with Nurse Yamada. She showed photographs of her husband, also deployed somewhere in the Pacific. She missed him. She worried. She was just another woman far from home. The propaganda had never mentioned American women could be homesick too. The wounded Americans began learning Japanese phrases from a pocket dictionary. They butchered the pronunciation terribly. But they tried. One sergeant with a leg wound spent hours practicing how to say good morning properly. His effort touched something deep in Nurse Tanaka's chest. Cultural confusion worked both ways. The Americans could not understand why the nurses bowed so frequently. The nurses could not understand why Americans smiled at strangers. The interpreter explained endlessly. Both customs mean respect, just shown differently. A young Marine gave Nurse Yamada a flower he had picked outside. She froze, terrified of the implications. The interpreter quickly explained, "He thanks you for saving his friend's life, nothing more." The Marine looked embarrassed when he realized his gesture had frightened her. Slowly, the nurses began to recognize individual soldiers. Private Johnson, who sang during dressing changes, Corporal Smith, who carved wooden animals, Lieutenant Davis, who wrote poetry. They had names. They had personalities. They were human. Years later, Nurse Yamada would struggle to tell her daughter about those months in American captivity. The words never came out right. How could she explain that the enemy had saved her life by not being the enemy she expected? Her daughter would look at her with confusion. "But Mother, were you not terrified?" "Terrified, yes, but not in the way anyone back home understood. The terror came from having everything you believed shattered. The terror was discovering mercy where you expected brutality. The terror was feeling grateful to the men you were taught to hate." Nurse Tanaka never spoke publicly about her experience. When neighbors asked about the war, she changed the subject. When her niece wrote a school report about the occupation, she remained silent. The truth felt like betrayal. How could she admit that American soldiers had shown more respect than some Japanese officers? In her diary, discovered after her death, Tanaka wrote the words she could never speak. "They gave us dignity when our own propaganda promised us shame. They fed us when our army left us to starve. They protected us when we expected violation. I cannot reconcile this with what we were told." Some nurses exchanged letters with American medical staff after repatriation. These correspondences remained hidden in drawer bottoms and old books. Betty, the American nurse, wrote to Yamada for 3 years. She sent photographs of her first child. She asked about Japanese medical techniques. She signed every letter with love and respect. The shame of returning untouched created its own burden. Other women who survived occupation faced suspicion and disgrace. But the nurses faced questions about why nothing had happened. Were they collaborators? Did they trade their bodies after all? The absence of trauma became suspect. Nurse Yamada married a doctor who never asked about the war. He knew she had been captured. He knew she had returned. That was enough. But sometimes she woke at night, remembering the American guard who gave her his own blanket during a cold spell. The memory felt like infidelity to everything she was supposed to believe. Decades passed before some nurses began sharing fragments of truth with younger generations. My granddaughter asks about the war. I tell her about kindness in unexpected places. I tell her propaganda lies on all sides. I tell her that enemies are human beings first. The cyanide vial remained in Yamada's possession until 1987. Then she threw it into the ocean. The poison had been her protection against dishonor that never came. Military records declassified in the 1990s revealed the scope of American policy regarding Japanese medical personnel. Strict orders from Pacific Command prohibited fraternization with female prisoners. Any soldier who violated these orders faced court-martial. The protection of nurses was not accidental kindness. It was military discipline. Yet policy alone does not explain everything. Soviet forces entering Manchuria showed no such restraint with Japanese nurses there. The testimonies from that region tell a different story entirely. The contrast haunted survivors from both experiences. Geography and conquering army determined fate more than any universal law of war. American occupation files documented 2,147 Japanese nurses processed as prisoners of war. Of these, 0 reported sexual assault by American forces. The statisticians found this number impossible. They rechecked their data 3 times. In war, zeros rarely exist in such categories. The Japanese Nursing Association began collecting oral histories in 1995. Many elderly nurses finally felt safe to speak. Their stories contradicted everything in school textbooks about American brutality. The association struggled with how to present these accounts without seeming unpatriotic or revisionist. Professor Haruki Sato researched these testimonies for 15 years. He concluded that the nurses' experiences created a crack in post-war Japanese identity. They could not demonize their occupiers completely. They carried gratitude they could not express. This psychological complexity influenced how they raised their children during Japan's reconstruction. Some American veterans also carried these memories differently than their combat experiences. Corporal Johnson, who sang during dressing changes, told his grandson about the Japanese nurse who saved his leg. She was terrified of us. We were terrified of infection. Fear made us all human. The occupation period saw Japanese women marry American soldiers, despite social disgrace. Some of these women were nurses from the camps. They had seen Americans at their most vulnerable, wounded and homesick. The propaganda image dissolved when you held a dying enemy soldier's hand while he called for his mother. Modern military ethics training includes these historical examples. The protection of medical personnel regardless of nationality became a cornerstone of civilized warfare. Though wars continue, the principle established in those Pacific hospitals endures in international law. Today, a small memorial stands at the site of the Saipan Hospital. It honors all medical personnel who served there. American and Japanese names appear side by side. Nurse Yamada's granddaughter placed flowers there in 2019. She left a note in English and Japanese. "Thank you for showing mercy when mercy was unexpected.